All right, we're now live.
Lovely.
Of course, so thank you everyone for joining us. This is our speaker series. We have Charee Mosby-Holloway from Columbia College, Chicago, Director of Student Diversity and Inclusion. So yeah, thank you so much for being here today and being a part of our speaker series. I really appreciate it.
Of course. I'm excited to be here
So
to talk with you as always.
yeah, we have some great conversations. So I guess just the first question for everyone, like to get to know you a little bit. Where are you originally from and what brought you to Chicago?
I'll try to answer this quickly. So I'm originally from South Bend, Indiana, so not too far from Chicago. I grew up there most of my life. Went to college there at the University of Notre Dame. I came to Chicago after I completed graduate school at Ohio State University in 2009. So I've been here for, my gosh, it'll be almost 11 years soon, which is pretty wild to think about.
That's really where did you go to school? Where did you study in? Where did you study in college, and where did you go to college?
Yeah. So I went to the University of Notre Dame. It's actually its own city, so it's in Notre Dame, Indiana, but Notre Dame is sort of within the limits of the city of South Bend. So I went to college there. It was, it's a very interesting place. It is a Catholic university. It's a predominantly white institution. It's a very wealthy school. Many of the demographics of the student body were not, I was not fitting those categories. So it was an interesting experience. But I remember, I think it was my sophomore year in college, I took my first class on race and ethnicity in the 21st century. And it really kind of changed everything for me because it gave sort of voice and language to so many of the experiences I'd had around race and my own racial identity my entire life. And so that was really the reason that I stayed there. And then after I graduated from Notre Dame, I took a detour and worked at the University of Wyoming. That's a whole nother story how I ended up out west. But working sort of within higher education, working with underrepresented students, my own experience at my undergraduate institution really sort of, I don't know, it really drew me to working with students that had experiences like mine. So first generation college students of color, students that, may have some barriers to success in college. So then I went to graduate school at Ohio State for higher education and student affairs to really work on, building a career and supporting students in their academic and social goals.
Yeah, that's really cool, really good stuff. I mean, I'm glad you're able to share this with a wide audience of people who who should know about the work that you're doing and what you've committed yourself to. And like with that, like you've worked in multiple capacities with like diversity and social justice initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
And so like how has your life path brought you to that work and that passion?
Mm. It's really, it's really interesting. I mean, this, but I'm a big believer in that, everything happens for a reason and the universe will give you signs, even if you're trying to ignore them. And I think that, diversity, inclusion, and social justice has really been a theme, throughout my entire life. Even think about my parents. My parents are an interracial couple. And they were together and building a family in Indiana as an interracial couple in the 80s. So I think I was sort of raised with a spirit of like activism and involvement, and speaking out and having my voice heard, and I really credit that to my parents for instilling that in me. I also think just I've had all these signs, throughout my life, particularly in undergrad, like I said, being feeling very excluded as an undergraduate student. And it was really the folks like Black faculty and staff at the university that sort of pulled me in and created safe places and guidance and mentorship that allowed me to succeed. And I really wanted to be that person for other students and provide that same sort of guidance and mentorship and support. And my career is really, I'm very lucky in that my career has allowed me to do that in a lot of different ways. So through diversity education, through, student activities and involvement and programming, diversity, equity, and inclusion is in everything. And so you can do it in so many different ways. And I've been lucky to be able to do that in my career.
So what was your previous experience before coming to Columbia in terms of like career oriented initiatives and things like that?
So in terms of like my own career or support?
Yeah, in terms of your own career. And like, did you always see yourself coming into like, working in this field and, elevating yourself to being, a director of a diversity office, at a university or college?
So the short answer to that is absolutely not. I really didn't. So like I said, when I graduated college, I ended up at the University of Wyoming. I had a really good friend from school that was working there doing work with Indigenous and Native American students, of which there's a fairly large population of those students at the University of Wyoming. And there was a similar job in sort of supporting Black students at the college that opened up. And I just graduated college. I was working in insurance, which was the worst. And she was like, hey, apply for this job. I think that, a lot of these students are having the same kind of struggles that you did. And I think that you could that you could really help. And so I ended up interviewing, sort of, fell in love with the idea of this job and working with students. And so went to the University of Wyoming, which when I was there had a very tiny population of Black students. And that was the first time I'd experienced sort of barriers to success, like systemic barriers to success as a student. But I'd never experienced those barriers from the sort of staff side or the administrative side of higher education. And so that job was really illuminating in that way that, in much of my experience, so much of success was on the individual, right? Like if you just work hard enough, if you do the things that you're supposed to, you'll be successful. And working in that job really sort of highlighted to me that, you could have a student who literally does everything that they're supposed to do, and they can still not graduate for reasons that are totally beyond their control, right? Because of the systems that we've set up and the barriers that have been placed in the path of so many students. So that's why I decided to go to grad school. I wanted to learn more about how those systems work, how higher education in the United States sort of came to be, who it was built for, what are the reasons for some of those barriers, and then how do we disrupt them and transform them. And so going to graduate school really gave me that sort of like theoretical, practical knowledge that I needed. And then starting my career after graduate school was really interesting. I started a job in diversity education. So I was mainly facilitating workshops around like diversity and cultural competency and things like that.
Right.
Which, I would never do a workshop on cultural competency now. I don't really believe in it anymore. But at that point in my career, I was like, yes, I'm doing the good things. And I've been lucky enough to continue to grow in my career and continue to have more opportunities. And I think, one of the reasons that I've been able to, quote unquote, advance in my career to a director level is because I pay attention to systems. And I always want to know sort of why are they the way they are? Because I think if you can figure out sort of how they were created and why they're that way, then again, you can figure out ways to interrupt them, to deconstruct them, and to transform them into something different to allow all students to have access to education and to pursue their goals.
Yeah, that's I've seen the work that you've done, and it's been great to like work alongside you and like see, what we're going towards, like in terms of creating a better place and working more, microwave like through Columbia.
Mm.
but in that, I know that you also are, right, a professor at the University of Chicago. Um,
Right,
is that the right way to say it?
lecturer. I'm not professor. I'm a
Lecturer, lecturer. Okay, I didn't want to. I didn't know if they were like
someday maybe.
synonymous or not, but okay, lecturer. So in that, what's the difference between a professor and a lecturer?
Yeah. So a professor would be, one, someone that has a terminal degree in that field, and I do not have a terminal degree in social work.
Okay.
That's not my background, and I teach in the School of Social Service Administration at UChicago. I specifically teach on race and the social meaning of race, so how we construct race and deconstruct race historically and over time. And so I really, focus on that kind of one area within the college, and again, working with social work students to think about what role does race and racism, and the ways in which we make meaning of race, how does that influence their work as a social worker? How does that influence how they participate in communities that maybe they don't necessarily belong to or share identities with? So it's really been a rewarding experience, not something I ever really saw myself doing. I teach all the time, but really in more of like a workshop, facilitation kind of format. And so being in the classroom just wasn't something I thought was in the cards, but it was a fantastic opportunity for myself to learn and grow, and to really sort of participate in diversity and inclusion work in a different sort of way.
And how has that, has that taught you anything? Has there been any challenges in regards to like being a lecturer? And do you even have goals to become a professor at in some capacity?
I feel like, have you been on the phone with my mom? She's like,
maybe we connected before.
she's like, go get your doctorate. Yeah, maybe someday when I have, and all that free time I have, I'll go back and get my doctorate. I've learned so much through teaching. It's really been kind of a through the looking glass experience, sort of experiencing learning on the other side. And what I mean by that is, in my role in sort of student affairs, our work is really focused on supporting students. And so we do that in a variety of different ways. And I also experience the barriers and limitations to student success through that particular lens. Being an instructor, right, or a lecturer, I think that has given me an experience in a different sort of way and allowed me to ask some different questions, like why is it that a syllabus is constructed like this particular way? Or how do we value knowledge? Or how do I make sure that the readings that I'm assigning to my students are reflective of the values that I espouse around diversity, equity, and inclusion? So how do I include Black and brown writers and women of color and queer folks and disabled folks? How do I make sure that that's represented in the curriculum and also in the ways that I'm engaging with students in the classroom? And so I think it's given me this entirely new lens in which to look at diversity and equity and inclusion.
Right. That's I think that's a really good way to like challenge yourself and to also continuously learn more about it. Is to like, a lot of people have said like, you know something when you're able to teach it,
Yeah.
or able to, talk about it or whatever like that. And I think, being, a lecturer, teacher, professor in that kind of vein, and if you, go to those, heights, and I know, I mean, just being, so busy with a lot of stuff, and it's just like to add that onto it would be, a lot to deal with. But in that, just a quick little question, like why not do that at Columbia?
Why not teach at Columbia?
I mean, this is kind of just like a more of a personal kind of thing, but I just wondering why. Because I mean, I think a lot of students would benefit from what you have to say. I mean, I enjoy listening to you talk and like, everything like that, but
Thank you.
just get a little curious about that. Or like why, even like just why the University of Chicago instead of like, I know like you worked at DePaul, and and stuff like that?
Mhm. Um, so I feel like I've done a lot of teaching, not necessarily in the classroom.
Right.
Though I have taught in the classroom before undergraduate students prior in my career. Um, but the ways that I've done teaching has been through like diversity and inclusion trainings and workshops. And so, I mean, you know this, but at Columbia, we do lots of workshops for student leaders and staff on campus around anti-racism and cognitive bias and racial equity and gender inclusion and all kinds of things, right? Because education is such a foundational component of understanding sort of larger issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I've always kind of thought of myself as an educator, even if it hasn't necessarily been my
All
title.
right.
And I think that's really important because I think that we value knowledge that happens in the classroom more than we value knowledge that happens in other spaces and
Right.
places and from other people. And if we look at who is, disproportionately represented in the classroom, that means a lot of voices and a lot of knowledge are being left out. And so I think we have to, challenge that a little bit. I don't teach at Columbia for, there's so many different reasons. It's very hard with, you have adjunct faculty and full-time faculty, and I'm staff, and, it can be tough to teach as a staff person.
Yeah.
So yeah, if the opportunity became available, I'd love to do it. Again, in all that free time that I have, but.
Yeah, I guess I guess that is I mean working and teaching where you like spend a lot of time. I mean, for me, if I was to put myself in those shoes, it would be pretty difficult because it's like I would want a separate space.
Yeah.
Kind of thing of like, I'm here and I'm like giving knowledge in a classroom setting in a different part of the city with a different group of students. And then I'm doing my, my diversity and inclusion work here at the other college. And I think that actually is a benefit, like, I mean, to like society in a way, because it's like more people get to know who you are and the work that you're doing and are part of it in that kind of way. So you like extend like your wings and you're able to like embrace more people and like have a wider scope of what you can do and who you can influence, or even like in a sense of like maybe someone that's a good connection for someone. Maybe someone at Columbia that's like, oh, someone from one of your students might benefit from connecting there, or vice versa.
Yeah.
So I think that's cool.
This as someone who has 5 million jobs and commitments. But I think that we have an idea that like you get a job and that's just the job you have for the rest of your life. And that's really not how the world works for most people. Most of us will have sort of multiple jobs throughout our lifetime. And for me, I'm always thinking about, I never want to get bored or stagnant in my work, particularly when it comes to, issues of diversity and equity. Because I think once you stop sort of challenging yourself, once you stop reading and engaging and seeking out new opportunities, you can be really complacent, and you can become, the oppressed can become the oppressor super fast. And so, part of the reason that I like to diversify my experience is a way of holding myself accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that as well, like in regards to like, not wanting to be stagnant and not wanting to, be complacent in certain areas of my life. Especially like for me, a lot of my focus has been like on like kinds of professionalism and like career oriented stuff and what I can do for the community and things like that. And sometimes it's hard to remember to put myself first in a lot of instances. So probably like, how do you decompress and re-energize yourself, doing all these different things throughout the course of a week or so? Like, how does that factor into your schedule at all? Or how do you deliberately make time to do that?
I just want to say I feel very called out right now. You're like, okay, you need to go get your doctorate. You need to take better care of yourself. I hear you, Isaiah.
No call out.
No. I think you know, self-care is so complicated, I think, particularly
Absolutely.
for Black folks in this moment, really throughout time, but definitely in this moment, you know, it's hard. Um, you know, you can't escape the things that are happening in the world, whether you want to or not. You know, it's kind of everywhere in your face all the time. Um, so for me, I try to just, you know, I focus on the small things, like, you know, making sure that I'm like preparing a meal every day, making sure that I'm reading like at least one book that is like not related to anything that I need to teach or anything that I need for work. So something just completely, you know, outside of that. So I read a lot of, you know, science fiction written specifically by Black women, and speculative fiction. You know, that's my thing. Um, I also, you know, my family, I have two nieces, three nephews, and a great nephew. And so they are really, it sounds super cheesy, but they are really, they're really good reminders that Black people and people of color have survived so much for so long. And we're going to continue to survive, you know, whatever happens, because that is what we do. We continue to thrive and find joy. And so I try to, you know, find and take the moments of joy where I can.
Yeah, I think it's always the small things. Enjoy the little things. Is usually something I try to do. Like, you know, even if it is just a routine in the morning before I leave the house, where I
Mhm.
know I'm gonna make something to eat, drink something, maybe watch a show or a video or whatever it is, just to, you know, get ready for the day. The small things that make me feel, you know, better about
Yeah.
myself. But in that and transitioning a little bit to like kind of like voting and activism,
Mhm.
you know, we have the election coming up on Tuesday. I wanted to just like get your broad scale views and ideas about like voting and like the current processes, and does it work? Does
Yeah.
it disproportionately target some people? How does that look for getting access to it? Um, so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. Um, and you've been part of some of those conversations, right? Of my initial response when I hear from students or from other folks, you know, that I'm not voting, right? I don't believe in voting. My initial response is to no, we have a responsibility. Like everyone's voice needs to be heard. And, you know, this is our civic duty and our right and all of these things. And I firmly believe that deeply. Um, I have my, you know, vote earrings and I have all my stuff that, and I'm always, you know, talking to students about making sure that they have a plan for voting and that they have access. I was just part of an event yesterday talking to faculty about, you know, supporting students before and after the election. And so it's definitely a civic process that I feel is incredibly important.
Hmm.
However, I think multiple things can be true. Um, you know, there are lots of arguments that folks can give for not voting, and some of which are just disingenuous, but some that are very, very real. And I think that I'm hard pressed to tell someone who's not voting because they've been failed by a system over and over and over again. I don't know how to argue against that.
Yeah.
You can say, well, we can change the system from within. Sometimes it's also really hard to do that. I also believe there are multiple ways to create change and to create social change specifically. And voting is, you know, one sort of piece of that. So while I believe, you know, strongly in voting and, you know, plan to exercise my right to vote, um, I also understand and can empathize with some of the reasons why folks, particularly marginalized folks and vulnerable folks, would not necessarily have a lot of faith in that process,
Hmm.
um, particularly the process that we have in the United States.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot going on. I mean, a lot of voter suppression happening, and there's just a lot of different tactics that are being, deployed and things like that, to get people from preventing them from able to vote. United States Postal Service has been, the center of attention for the last few months in regards to them trying to cut funds from them and, have them, basically defunded in that kind of way when they are kind of a pillar of affordable mailing in our country. They allow people to receive and ship mail, at a very, cheap rate or for free. And that's really instrumental for marginalized groups and disadvantaged communities and communities that live, like off the grid in a way, like, our indigenous folks live on reservations. That's how they get most of their mail is the United States Postal Service. And also other communities, those private kind of corporations, if there's not profit in getting to certain communities, they're not going to prioritize getting there. So like even with that, and then, making sure that, we can get our mail-in ballots on time, because there are people that prefer to mail in their ballot, whether it's because they have work and they can't get off work on that day, whether or not, probably a little bit older and just aren't physically able to get out of their home or have a ride there, reliable transportation. And also the biggest thing this year, COVID. That's a big thing. A lot of people plan, like say, all right, I'm just gonna mail in my ballot, no big deal. But then had to go through these hoops of like the administration, the Trump administration, on the federal level, stopping that kind of, advancement of the vote in and of the ballot. So people have to go in person. A lot of people, historic records of people voting early right now is going on. And I know that you're doing some work on election day. So can you tell, everyone, what you're doing and how that process is and, why you decided to do it?
Yeah. So I signed up to be, I'll be a poll worker for election day. So if you're heading out to the polls in person, you might see me there behind my mask and face shield. And I'm really excited. I wanted to do it in part because, with so many voting locations closing around the country, we know that voting locations are often very limited in the communities that need access to them the most. We also know that many of our poll workers are, belong to categories that make them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. And so it was just something that I felt like I could do. I had the ability to, take some vacation time from work to go do it. And so I felt like that was a way that I could participate that felt, comfortable to me. I'm a little bit nervous about it. Just there's a lot to do, a lot to sort of figure out, but I'm excited because I've never participated in the process, through that lens. So I'm excited to sort of learn more and see how it works and hopefully, help folks as they are exercising their right to vote.
Yeah, that's I'm glad, you're participating in our democracy, I guess, in that kind of way of being able to like put yourself out there and volunteer your time to do so, because a lot of folks don't really have the time to do it or the energy to do it or the desire to do it. And I think that's really important in moving things along in that kind of way. So the election is coming up. How do you feel about like the energy just like surrounding our election and like, from both sides, whether or not you endorse a candidate is up to you. But like the energy has been different. And this is kind of like, for me personally, this is like all I've really known in terms of the politics of it. Obama was elected when I was in the 4th grade.
Oh my God.
Right. So it's not like I saw the process and anything like that. And even when I saw him run against John McCain, it was pretty civil from what I remember. And even in his reelection going up against Mitt Romney, that was also decently civil. But then, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and that kind of campaign, and then now Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I've seen these two campaigns where I am aware, I am of age, and I know what's going on for the most part. And I've just seen like these dirty tactics being used, and I've seen media be screwed in so kind of ways, corruption from other countries. So like for me, in a way, this is the norm. Like it's not something that I have really not experienced in terms of presidential elections.
Yeah.
So I just want to like get your feelings on that kind of that stuff and like how it's changed over time I mean, like I'm aware of like the 2000 election, which was also very controversial and things of that nature. And I could probably compare in a similar way in terms of like being so close and having not knowing the results until days later, in that kind of way. But I mean, the way that these folks have campaigned for the last 8 years in terms of presidential elections have been the norm for me.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that, voter suppression is not anything new, right? Like,
Right.
it's an American pastime. For as long as people have been voting, we've been putting restrictions on who can vote based on who we value and who has power.
Right.
And we don't need to go into a history lesson, but even the electoral college itself, right, which is an incredibly flawed system, that is deeply connected to the history of slavery in this country.
Yep.
And protecting that particular institution, that we still rely on, and that just doesn't make a lot of sense, in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't make any sense at all. I think that voting has been used as it's one of the tools of control that a state can use, not just in America, but any sort of state can use to control sort of who has power, who has access to power, and all of those things. So I think, if we look at it historically, even if we just keep the focus on America, a lot of what is happening is not necessarily new, right? It's and these are my views, right? My own personal views, but I think one of the things I talk about in teaching is that white supremacy has, if you think of like a white supremacy toolbox, there are a bunch of tools in there that we've used over and over again to sort of support and prop up that system. Voter suppression is one of those. Limiting who has access, voter intimidation, all of those things, legislation, all of those things have been used to sort of prop up those systems. And so a lot of that is not new. Even if you look at sort of the, folks will talk about the sort of lack of civility. And I'm like, well, one, I could argue that, civility is not always a good thing. But if you look back at like presidential elections in the past, think about like Abraham Lincoln, right? Like the stuff that was being like written and said about him is pretty mind-blowing. So that's not to take anything away from like the anxiety and the frustration and the stress of this moment. But to say that like this is all brand new, I think it's just not accurate.
Right.
It might look a little bit different, but I think a lot of the tactics that we're seeing are pretty, it's old stuff that's maybe just been repackaged a little bit. I think, with this election, particularly since the 2000s, since Gore and Bush, we've really seen like the failings of the electoral college. And, multiple times that the person or the candidate that has received the popular vote is not the person who receives electoral college votes. And so I think that we're really seeing, we are seeing the limits in our system. That to me is an opportunity of like, okay, so is now the moment that we can think about imagining something different, that we can think about imagining a process that is more fair and more equitable. So that's my hope, is that, this can potentially be an opportunity for us to really reimagine what voting looks like in this country. I don't know. I'm gonna try to hold on to that hope for as long as possible.
Yeah, I was actually right before we got on to pass time between the interview I just completed. I was watching a video about the electoral college and its ties to slavery, and like how white slave owners weren't sure that they would be represented when voting, because not too many people lived in the South. Most of the population were enslaved folks, and they didn't even count enslaved people as a person. It was 3/5 of a person, and then that kind of stuff. And that like electoral college imbalance does that now, where it kind of disproportionately represents a group of people, whereas though there's not that many people in a particular region, but they have a lot of electoral vote power in determining, who is elected. And as you talked about, like, voter suppression in regards to, Black folks, grandfather clause, literacy tests, poll taxes. Yeah, now it's like, if your name doesn't match all government issued ID, you can't vote in some places. You have to have a photo ID in certain places as well. Illinois has done, I think, from my understanding, it's been pretty easy to be able to vote once you're here, because I'm not from here. My license is from New Jersey. I was worried about voting. I was like, oh my God, do I get a mail-in ballot? Then I was like, oh wait, the postal service is too slow. I don't really feel confident in getting it shipped to me, filling it out, shipping it back right now. So I'm like, how can I get this done? I even considered at one point just like flying out to Jersey and just like being able to just like vote. I was like, is that the easiest way to do it? And the fact that I have to think to that way just shows how, how deeply flawed the system could be. I mean, fortunately for me, I did my research and I figured out, I didn't have to bring my passport and some mail I received to my current address where I live here in Chicago. And it's that simple. But like in some states, that isn't necessarily the case at all. Like sometimes it's not even that. And then some people, especially in Texas, they have to travel so far just to vote. I've been reading it and it's just like there's only one polling place for like 100 miles or 50 miles and stuff like that. I'm just like that's a lot of just kind of getting people not wanting to vote and incentivizing them to vote. And then, they don't vote or they do vote, and then electoral college determines the president or whatever, and then they just don't feel like their vote has enough power. And you hear that coming particularly from metropolitan areas, so like Chicago, New York, LA kind of thing. But that's because we're represented, but not fairly in certain cases, because we have a lot of people, we have a lot of constituents and representatives in that kind of way, but it's all consolidated in one part of the state for the most part, and then the rest of the state has a lot more power and representation and having more people do all that kind of stuff. It's going to get confusing, so I'm not going to get much into that.
I'm with you.
But it's a lot. But in regards to that, talking about how people, they have some issues with voting and not wanting to vote, particularly young folks. I wanted to draw on to like the Black Lives Matter movement, how we've seen that kind of grow in the past decade. As we've seen footage, photographic evidence, all that kind of stuff, body cams in some cases, mainly cell phone footage though, from our regular citizens, releasing this footage, and we're like, oh, this is an open and shut case. They have the footage right there. It's not more like they said versus they said. It's kind of just like, this is the footage. That's it. Like this should be an open and shut case. That's not the case a lot of the times. And a lot of young folks, I know particularly in my, generation of people or people in my age group, we see this kind of distrust with our elected officials because we have something such as the Black Lives Matter movement. And this can go to all kinds of movements that we've seen, push for climate change, women's rights, reproductive rights, all that kind of stuff. And things just seem like to not really change, or they're not receptive to that kind of momentum that we have or our voice. And I wanted to just like get your take on like that movement and how, younger folks have pushed forward and what we can do as a society, as collective folks, to lead our way into the future, from folks who are older than us, from generation that came before us, but also for kids that are growing up in this as well.
Yeah. I think, first of all, when are you running for office? I feel that in your future at some point. I think, it's really interesting. I think about, students living in this moment, right? Especially students that this is their first time at college, they're 18, first time away from home, living in the residence halls. Like I think about that student in my head and kind of living in this moment in time. And I can't think of anything in my own experience that would be even like remotely comparable to that. I think about, I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened. It was like my first or second week, I think, in school. And that's the only thing I can think of, in which I can connect to that sort of like widespread anxiety and fear and complete uncertainty and unknown. And I think about, the legacy of 9/11, which has been a war, that we're arguably still participating in, for almost 2 decades now. And it it gives me a lot of fear, right? For what might be next on the horizon for us. That being said, I think that, with the ways that we think about generations, we always have to nuance that conversation. I absolutely believe, I mean, it's one of the reasons that I work with college age students, or folks that are in college, because I think it's, generally when you're in college, it's at a time where you are, maybe questioning things, sort of figuring out who you are, what you believe in, establishing your values, whether you're a new student, your first time in college, or if you're, an older student going back for a second time. That's one of those reasons that I like sort of working in that particular field. But I also think we have to be very careful about making generalizations that, everyone who is part of this age group or this identity group, believes in these things.
Right.
Because that's just not true. And so I think one of the things that gives me hope, though, is that I'll often see students engaging with other students. Whether that's debate or they're having an argument about something that's happening in the world, but I feel like you all are just so much more equipped, not just college age students, but like elementary age students on up they're far more equipped to like engage in a discourse about what kind of world they want to see. That was something that didn't happen for me until 9/11. That was really the moment that sort of opened up my worldview to sort of outside of my own kind of limited experience at that point in my life. And so I think that I have a lot of hope that folks will continue to sort of engage with each other and engage in that discourse. I think with Black Lives Matter, I always sort of go back to history. And you were mentioning before about, all the videos that we've seen of police brutality, and the sort of trauma and violence that's been inflicted. That's not new.
Right.
We've had that evidence for a very long time of how Black communities have been terrorized by various state forces. We had a whole era in our history, right? If we think of Jim Crow, right, where it was, and slavery before that, right, where that terror was legalized. And so to think that we are not sort of living with the legacy of all of that, I think is just incredibly naive. And I think that, having that historical knowledge and being able to have that historical analysis is so important in the context of this movement. And so when I'm having conversations with you and with other students, I love, that you're able to think about, like, you're talking about the history of the electoral college. Like, I love that you're sort of thinking about that, engaging with that, because I think that's really important to sort of understanding how these systems work. And the hopeful part of me, the tiny optimist in me, I think that maybe folks are unprepared, because I think that's a piece of some movements that's been missing a little bit. If folks haven't been able to say, like, well, here's your entire system is failing. So actually, I don't want to be a part of it. I want to create something new. I want to transform this, and I want to hold you accountable. I'm not settling for the little bit of leftovers that you want to give to me. I want to create something entirely different. And that to me feels a little bit different than what we've seen before.
Yeah, even with like changing things and wanting things to be a little different at the very least, because what we've seen is just not working. And I do appreciate when it's like smaller, cities and places like that that can enforce certain things that allow us to see what they can look like, and then we can, use that as a precedent. But one thing that I know that has gained attention a lot this past summer has been, calls to defund the police.
Mhm.
And with that kind of, message. And that's basically just like reallocating the funds that they say we don't have from the police department into other social services, education, healthcare, mental health clinics, and things of that nature. But at the same time, we're out there marching all summer about that kind of stuff. And we've seen places that have already done that where they have, not taken some money out of the police department and put it into certain communities, and they've seen crime be reduced, or at least crime not go up, right? Because the police presence doesn't equate safety. They respond to what people call them in for. Chicago is one of the most heavily policed cities in the country, and yet the stereotype is still always about crime rates and all the other kinds of stuff. And we're like, well, if that's the case, we have so many police, there should be not that much crime.
Mhm.
That's not the case. But then anyway, kind of like I wanted to gain like some insight on like how Mayor Lori Lightfoot released, a citywide survey to everyone from her office, and was like, fill us out about our budget because COVID has hit. She has to obviously manage that stuff. The revenue in our city is down or whatever, and she wants to see how the funds should be distributed.
Mhm.
And a lot of people called for like, not putting too much money in the police department, reducing their budget, and putting it into social services. And she said no. She said that that's not going to happen. And this isn't after, a protest and you have, someone speaking and just calling it and she's responding to that individual person. This is a citywide poll, an official one from her office, and she has completely ignored the results of that. So how can we move forward from that? Is it time like we replace our mayor, like when she's up for re-election,
Mhm.
or do we kind of like try to work with her the best we can to get the goals that we want to accomplish, such as CPAC?
Yeah. I think that's such a great question. And I think, for me, it's always a both and. I think very rarely is sort of one thing the only thing that can be true or the only possible solution.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's multiple ways that we have to sort of attack this. If you think about oppression largely, right? Oppression happens on so many different levels, right? It can be individual, sort of person to person. It can be your own internalized oppression. It happens at a systems level, at an institutional level, at a group level, in so many different spaces and ways and places. While that's scary, I also think that it allows us some insight of if oppression is happening on all of these different levels, right? If racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism is happening on all of these different levels in all of these different ways, that means that there's all of these different levels and all of these different ways that we can fight it, that we can interrupt it, that we can transform it, that we can deconstruct it, that we can change it completely. And so I think that there's no, just sort of personally, I don't think that there's one way that we're going to find our way, to a solution. But I do think that, I mentioned earlier that I'm a huge fan of speculative fiction, right?
Right.
Like Octavia Butler, N.K. Jemisin, right? Those I think are visionary folks. And one of the reasons that I'm so, that I love that work and the work of folks like Walida Marisha and Adrienne Maree Brown is that I think that it's super important that we allow that space to imagine and dream of things that are totally outside of what we know. Because as you mentioned before, the systems that we put in place have been in place for a very long time.
Right.
And they've never served the needs, right? They've never met the needs of everyone in our community. And I think unless we think about how do we open that up, right? How do we meet the needs of everyone in our community? Because we know that if we meet the needs of the most vulnerable people in our communities, if we meet the needs of the folks that are the most disenfranchised, every single person in the community is going to benefit from that. But I think that that's a real challenge, that folks are deeply, deeply invested in what they know because breaking awake from what you know is terrifying. And so to think about like, well, what does the world without police look like? Like, I can understand how that might be scary for some. It's not scary for me, but I can understand, why that might be a scary thought for someone. And I think that's why it's important, right, that we continue to imagine how things can look differently, and we continue to try different ways, that multiple movements are happening and multiple approaches to movements are happening. So there are always going to be those folks that want to sit down at the table and they want to hammer out a solution. And then there are going to be those folks that are like, y'all can do that. We're going to be over here building our own community, right, outside of your rules and your restrictions. And I think that we have to allow room for all of that. Otherwise, we limit ourselves from what's possible, and we limit ourselves from how the world might look different and how the world might be more equitable.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading a lot of utopian and dystopian works, mainly for class. But at the same time, it's been interesting to read that kind of the stuff, and I'm always been under the impression of, like, even before reading that, as like, as a society, I would think that we would want to move away from such a heavy police presence, whatever that looks like. I'm not saying to fire all the officers that are employed right now. That's the call, like a lot of people are worried about, like them being laid off and stuff. But I do think a lot of the police unions that we have, hold too much power, in the sense that they're officers who commit, crimes while on the job and are not held accountable at any step of the way. Like, there's some things where, if an officer gets sued, they can't really be sued because there's no precedent before, but they can't be sued. So it's like, how is there ever going to be a precedent if they can't be sued and no one can make a decision on a case, right?
Yeah.
Or if as soon as, they commit a crime, or they, shoot someone, and they have 2 days to, get a statement together, look at the evidence that they already have against them, and prepare something with that kind of stuff. Like, the power that they have is just too much. And it's like, there's certain practices where, like, I mean, if I'm late to a job working at Target 3 times, I'm going to be fired. But the officer can come out there, shoot someone in cold blood, and have it be a pattern, or at least have, murders on their record, assault allegations on their record, other kinds of, claims against them on their record, and still hold this job and still be used to, like, police people, have the power to take someone's life, have the power to change the course of someone's life just by saying, oh, we arrested you, we're going to put these charges on you. Whether or not they're true or not, that's going to hurt so many people and put them in a system that they didn't ask for. And then coming back to, like, voting, they may not even be able to vote because of what they have charged against them, or if they spend time in prison. So, working to dismantle those kinds of systems is taking a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time and energy. And, I think, it's so hard to really just change the world, just sort of snap your finger. I mean, I wish we could, because I would do it all the time.
Yeah.
But I do think that, changing the world does start with us, and us just impacting the people around us. Even as something as small as that, to being as big as, being as influential as the president of the United States. I think, a lot of people think that, oh, only people in those kinds of power can change the world. And we're like, not necessarily. I mean, everyone has that kind of power in some kind of way, whether it's me providing food for people who may not be able to get it, starting some kind of community organization, hiring and, taking out elected officials with my power to vote, and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I want to be mindful of your time, respectful of that, but, like, just to, like, wrap up, and, like, some like thoughts on, like, our I would say responsibility, in the sense that, like, as people working together, because I think humans are inherently communal beings. Like, we're inherently want to work together, want to be around each other, help each other, and that kind of thing. But so many things have been created and instituted that we just can't do it. And in our system now, Angela Davis talks about this a lot, like how both candidates that we have for president are at both kind of spectrums tied to corporate capitalism in a certain kind of way. Whether, how extreme or less extreme or whatever it is, they're both tied to it in some kind of way. So kind of like, I just wanted to get your thoughts on like, how we move forward, how we change the world and our community just by existing and by helping those around us.
Yeah, that's a big question. And that's something that, I struggle with every day, right?
Yeah.
Is what I'm doing making an impact? Is it going to have a lasting impact on this student or on this place, right, that I've chosen to spend my time? And that's difficult. So again, like I look to history, um, particularly as a Black person in this world. I look at this sort of incredible legacy that we come from, the legacy of resilience and survival and innovation and joy. And I try to hold that, kind of close to myself of, this is something that is going to outlast me. So I may not see necessarily the broad scale changes that I would like to see in my lifetime, but I have hope that my people will continue to thrive and survive and do good work. I think there is a level of personal responsibility. I struggle sometimes with the language of personal responsibility because I
Right, me
think that,
too. I do too.
yeah, right, because we have created a world that is so very stratified, right, that or stratified, that sometimes it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter how hard you work, or it doesn't matter how positive your attitude is, or it doesn't matter how you dress or how you talk or any of that, right? That so much of our sort of life plan and life path is decided before we're even born into the world. And that is something that that has to change.
Right.
We can't live in a world where your area code, right, or your zip code is a primary indicator of your path in life, or a primary indicator of whether you're going to survive past the age of 25. That to me is sort of unacceptable. And I think, as you were mentioning, it goes against our natural instinct as humans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's one of the ways, right, that if we think about an institution like slavery, why it was able to survive and thrive for so long, because you have to see people that you are hurting and harming, you have to see them as less than. You have to see them as sort of outside of the circle of humanity in order to cause that kind of harm, because it's not our natural state of being as
Right.
human beings. That's not how we sort of move through the world. That's not how we're built. If it were, we would not have survived as long as we
At
have,
all. Yeah.
right? And so I think that while personal responsibility is definitely part of it, I think that personal responsibility for me is more about, and I have this conversation with students a lot, is deciding, what do you want your participation to look like? If you want the world to be different, how do you want to participate in that change? And I think we have to get out of like the old narratives of, again, there's one way to participate, or there's one way to affect change. One that's super exclusionary to lots of folks that have lots of different identities, right? Like, not everyone can go out and protest.
Right.
Like, they're physically not able to, or mentally not able to, or they've got to work, or they have, other safety concerns that they can't do it. But does that mean that they cannot participate in the movement? Does that mean that they cannot contribute something that is of incredible value and incredibly necessary? No, I don't believe that. I truly believe that there is like room and a path for everyone if they want it. But figuring out how to do that work and how to find it, that's the challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And figuring out what you want your toolkit to look like. So is voting a part of it? Is protesting a part of it? Are you more of a storyteller? For me, like, education is one form of activism that I'm deeply connected to. If I can give, students or folks that I'm working with some skills to think about their role in the world in a different kind of way, then that to me feels like I'm contributing to something,
Yeah.
and feels necessary to me. And so I think that, to do that work of sort of figuring out, how do you want to, if you want the world to look different, if you don't want the world to look different, that's a whole nother thing. But
Yeah.
if you want the world to look different, if you want the world to be more just, and you want the world to be more equitable, then you have to do the work of figuring out, okay, then what is my role? How is that going to look for me? How am I going to contribute based on, what talents, what skills, what do I have available that I can contribute? For some folks, particularly for, marginalized folks and vulnerable folks, your resistance might just be your very existence. It might just be getting up every day, right? And existing
Yeah.
in a world that doesn't want you to be here, or
Hmm.
existing in a world that is actively sort of fighting against you. So all that to say that I do believe that there are multiple ways that we can participate in change. Figuring out what that looks like for yourself is deeply personal. But there are so many resources out there. There are so many models. And there are so many different ways I think that this journey can play out. And so I try not to get too bogged down into the sort of, the anxiety and stress is there, especially about the upcoming election. I'm
Yeah.
scared too. I'm scared for myself. I'm scared for the people that I love in this world. I'm scared for humanity on a large scale. I'm scared for a lot of different reasons. But I also try to hold on to, but people are still doing the work every single day. People are still getting up and contributing to their communities. They're still getting up and holding themselves accountable, holding the folks in their circle accountable. That work is still happening, and it'll continue to happen regardless of what happens on November 3rd.
Yeah. I, that's a great way to wrap things up. Nice. And I mean, it's really true. I mean, us just having to, get up and exist sometimes is a lot, as a Black person, but then a lot of different intersections of our identity also contribute to that, once you do that. And I mean, it's just, we always have things to worry about and questions to ask ourselves. And I hope, hopefully a lot of people have had some insight from you on how to, get that process started, or even some answers to that question.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm much
yeah,
better at asking questions than giving answers.
yeah, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for reaching out.